Hello, so today we are going to be looking at Mrs Birling and what she did to Eva Smith. So we're going to start off by revising gallant from last lesson. So how does Gerald view his behaviour towards Eva Smith as gallant? So a slight variation of the question we looked at the end of last lesson. How are we shown that Gerald thinks he behaves gallantly towards Eva Smith? And our new word today is elite. So the elite is a group or class of people seen as having the most power and influence in a society, especially on account of their wealth or privilege. And that links into this idea of elitist. So if you are elitist, then you demonstrate a superior attitude or behaviour. Okay, so an elite is basically someone powerful and wealthy and influential. And if you have an elitist attitude, then you believe, because of your status as an elite, that you are better than others. So which character appears to be the most elitist in their attitudes and spectacles so far? So you can pause the video and answer those questions. So Gerald views his behaviour as gallant because he mentions that he became the most important person in her life, and that any man would have loved the idea of being like a wonderful fairy prince out of a fairy tale. So he believes that actually took a lot of pleasure in this idea of being the hero, of like a knight in shining armour, rescuing Eva Smith. It made him feel good about himself. Now, on one level, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But on another level, we can also view his actions towards Eva Smith as slightly selfish as well. So, which character appears to be the most elitist? Whilst Mr. Birling appears elitist, it is Mrs. Birling who is the real elite character here, certainly in her attitude. I mean, technically, Gerald is the most elite, considering he's the only one from the upper classes. But his attitudes don't come across as elitist or as obnoxious as Mrs. Birling's. Remember, we know that Mrs. Birling is Mr. Birling's social superior. We know that her breeding and the way she's been brought up is better, essentially, than Mr. Birling's. So she is a very elitist character, as we will see today. So today we're going to be focusing on Mrs. Birling. So how we're going to focus on how Priestley uses language to develop our impression of Mrs. Birling's character, and how this links into Priestley's beliefs and intentions in writing the novel. So just like yesterday, we are going to skip over to the play.
You know, Inspector, you never showed him that photograph of her.
It wasn't necessary.
You have a photograph of this girl?
Yes. I think you'd better take a look at it. You recognize her?
No.
Oh, I can't believe she could have changed so much.
I don't understand you.
You're not telling me the truth.
I beg your pardon.
Look here, Inspector, I'm not going to have this. You'll apologise at once.
For doing my duty?
For being so offensive about it. I'm a public man.
Public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges.
Now that's a really important line. Public men, Mr. Birling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. And this is, again, a socialist attitude. This idea that as public men, as men with high status and power, they have a responsibility to use that power for good rather than their own selfish gain.
Possibly, but you weren't asked to come here to talk to me about my responsibilities.
Let's hope not.
Now, that's ironic, because that is, of course, exactly why the inspector is there. He is there to make them change their view of responsibility to social responsibility. Again, a socialist view. And this is what we as the audience are supposed to be changing our opinion to.
Though I'm beginning to wonder.
Does that mean anything, Sheila?
It means that we've no excuse now for putting on airs, and that if we've any sense we won't try. Father threw this girl out because she asked for decent wages. I pushed her further out, right into the street, just because she was pretty. Gerald set her up as his mistress and then dropped her when it suited him. And now you're pretending you don't recognise her from that photograph. And if you're not telling the truth, why should the inspector apologise? Can't you see, Mother, you're making it worse?
Oh, it was the door again.
Gerald must have come back.
Unless your son has just gone out.
I'll see.
Mrs. Birling, you're a prominent member of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation.
Go on, Mother. You might as well admit it. Yes, she is. Why?
It's an organisation to which women in distress can appeal for help. Isn't that so?
We've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases.
Mrs. Birling, along with other rich women of her status, run a charity where women, presumably lower class women, can go and appeal to them for financial assistance and help. Now notice Mrs. Birling says we've done a great deal for deserving cases. So who decides if they deserve her help? Mrs. Birling decides. So with everything we know about Mrs. Birling, what we'd be discussing in class right now is what are her motivations for having a charity? Is it because she is so altruistic and cares about other people and really wants to help these girls? Or is it because it makes her look good? Is it because that sort of behaviour, charitable behaviour, is expected in someone of status and she's doing it for her reputation and not because she cares about these girls? And is she also doing it because she enjoys the power that it gives her deciding the fate of these young women, and she's the one that gets to decide whether they are deserving or not? So we see Mrs. Birling really symbolising here the hypocrisy of women like her. They pretend that they're doing this charity to help those less fortunate than themselves, but they're actually doing it to help themselves and help their reputation. And this is the conclusion that Priestley wants us as the audience to draw here.
You were in the chair of the interviewing committee 2 weeks ago, were you not?
And if I was, what business is it of yours?
Mrs. Birling.
It must have been Eric we heard go out.
Eric? Where can he have gone to?
Can't imagine. But he was in one of his excitable, queer moods, and even though we don't need him here...
We do need him here, and if he's not back soon, I shall have to go and find him.
Why?
I'll explain that when you've answered my questions.
Is there any reason why my wife should answer questions from you, Inspector?
Yes, a very good reason. You remember that Mr. Croft told us that he hadn't spoken to or seen Eva Smith since last September. But Mrs. Birling spoke to and saw her only 2 weeks ago.
Mother!
Is this true?
Yes, quite true.
She appealed to your organisation for help?
Yes.
Not as Eva Smith.
No, nor as Daisy Renton.
As what, then?
First, she called herself Mrs. Birling.
Mrs. Birling?
It was gross impertinence. Naturally, that was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case.
Oh, Eva Smith, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks before she killed herself, went to Mrs. Birling's charity for help. But unfortunately for her, she lied about her name. She called herself Mrs. Birling. Now, the real Mrs. Birling thought Eva Smith was just being rude. That's what she means by impertinent, means rude. And she says this is something that prejudiced her against Eva Smith's case. So automatically, Mrs. Birling had decided that she wasn't going to help her.
I should think so. Damned impudence.
You admit to being prejudiced against her case?
Yes.
And was it owing to your influence as the most prominent member of the committee that help was refused the girl?
Yes. I didn't like her manner. She'd impertinently made use of our name, though she pretended afterwards it just happened to be the first she thought of. She had to admit, after I began questioning her, that the story she told at first about a husband who deserted her was quite false.
So why lie then? Why say she has a husband that had deserted her? Now, we need to again think about the position of women in 1912. She would have had more sympathy had she been married. Because even though it was accepted that lots of young girls, you know, had to be forced into prostitution, and it was the rich men that were often sleeping with them, a woman was still considered to be disrespectful to themselves and their reputation if they had been having sex outside of marriage. So she thought that if she said she was married, yet her husband had run away, that would make them look at her more kindly.
Why did she want help?
You know very well why.
No, I don't. I know why she needed help. But as I wasn't there, I don't know what she asked from your committee.
I don't think we need to discuss it.
Mrs. Birling.
If you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. The girl made a claim for assistance. I wasn't satisfied with it. She seemed to me to be not a good case, and so I used my influence to have it refused. And in spite of what's happened to the girl since, I consider I did my duty. So if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind.
Yes, I have.
No, you haven't. Simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it.
I think you did something terribly wrong. And that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen...
No, please. I've imagined it enough already.
Then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child.
Oh,
Really?
oh, horrible. How could she have wanted to kill herself?
Because she'd been turned out and turned down too many times.
Mother, you must have known.
It was because she was going to have a child that she went for assistance to your mother's committee.
Oh, here is a new development then. Eva Smith went to Mrs. Birling's charity because she was pregnant. And what is even more horrifying is that when she chose to kill herself, she was not just killing herself, she was also killing her unborn child. And as the inspector says to Sheila, who is, again, unlike Mr. and Mrs. Birling, absolutely shocked and horrified, she'd been turned out and turned down too many times. She felt like she had no other options other than death. And rightly so, we are meant to feel incredibly shocked and horrified that society is so unwilling to help girls like Eva Smith that she was forced to do this to herself.
Look here. This wasn't Gerald Croft.
Oh,
No. Nothing to do with him.
thank goodness for that. Though I don't know why I should care now.
And you nothing further to tell me, Mrs. Birling.
I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility.
That doesn't make it any the less yours. She came to you for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. She was alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. And you slammed the door in her face.
Mother, that was cruel and vile.
I must say, Sybil, that when this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to do us much good.
So look at the different reactions between Sheila and Mrs. Birling. Sheila says, Mother, I think it was cruel and vile, so she thinks it's disgusting and cruel what Mrs. Birling did. And all Mr. Birling says is, oh, well, it's not going to look very good in the inquest. When there's an investigation, it's not going to make you look very good. It could affect your reputation. So we see where their priorities are.
Stop it, both of you. And before you start accusing me of anything, please remember that it wasn't I who had her turned out of her employment, which probably began it all. In the circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got at the truth, I discovered that she knew who the father was. So I told her it was her business to make him responsible. If he refused to marry her, and in my opinion he ought to be compelled to, then he must at least support her.
And what did she reply to that?
Oh, she was giving herself ridiculous airs, claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position.
When she says a girl in her position, she means lower classes. So when she's saying she was, appearing to have morals that were ridiculous in a girl of her class, it shows us that Mrs. Birling truly thinks if you're poor, that means that you are a bad person. There's nothing good about you. And if you're rich, it means that you're good. Think about her ignorance at Alderman Megarty, regularly sexually assaulting women. She would never think that would be possible simply because he's rich.
What did she say?
She said that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him.
Why didn't she want to take any more money from him?
Oh, some fancy reason. As if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money.
I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she give for not taking any more money?
Her story was that he'd said something one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money.
Where had he got it from then?
He'd stolen it.
So she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money.
That's the story she finally told, after I'd refused to believe her original story, that she was a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband. I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong to suppose I shall regret what I did.
But if her story was true, if this boy had been giving her stolen money, then she came to you for help because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any more trouble.
Possibly. But it sounded ridiculous. So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance.
You're not even sorry now, when you know what happened to the girl.
I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame for it.
Who is to blame, then?
First, the girl herself.
For letting Father and me have her chucked out of her jobs.
Secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If, as she said, he didn't belong to her class and was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him.
And if her story is true, that he was stealing money,
then he'd be entirely responsible, because the girl wouldn't have come to us and have been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him.
So he's the chief culprit, anyhow.
Certainly. And he ought to be dealt with very severely.
Mother, stop.
Be quiet, Sheila.
But don't you see?
You're behaving like a hysterical child tonight, Sheila.
Oh.
Inspector, if you take some steps to find this young man and make sure that he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here asking unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty.
Don't worry, Mrs. Birling. I shall do my duty.
I'm glad to hear it.
No hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility.
Certainly. And now, no doubt, you'd like to say good night.
Not yet. I'm waiting.
Waiting for what?
To do my duty.
Now, Mother, don't you see?
But surely... I mean... It's ridiculous.
Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this?
If he is, then we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Birling has just told us.
My God. Oh, look here.
I don't believe it. I won't believe it.
Mother, I begged you to stop, but would you?
You all know, don't you?
Oh, did you guess? Did you get the clues that actually Eric is the one who impregnated Sheila? Impregnated Eva Smith. I mean, thank goodness he didn't impregnate Sheila, because that would be a very, very different type of story. So Priestley deliberately drops hints and clues along the way to give us this idea that it is Eric who is the father of the baby. And we see that Sheila is the one who picks up on that before Mr. and Mrs. Birling. She tries to get Mrs. Birling to stop, but Mrs. Birling doesn't listen to her. We know that he was, she mentions that he was drunk, that he wasn't from the class, that, and also that he was stealing money. So we're going to look at Eric in tomorrow's lesson. But what I'd like you to do now is answer these questions. So what did Mrs. Birling do to Eva Smith? How did this finally drive Eva Smith to suicide? Does Mrs. Birling feel guilt? Why has Priestley shown, why show that actually she doesn't feel guilt? And what does Sheila's reaction to what her mother did reveal about the change in her character? So think about Sheila's line, "Mother, it was cruel and vile." How does that show a change in Sheila's character from the start? So you can pause the video now and just answer those questions. So finally then, we've picked back up on our word prejudice that we revised last lesson. Why do you think Priestley presents Mrs. Birling as being prejudiced, against the lower classes? How does that link into his intentions? And how is Mrs. Birling presented as an elitist character in the play? Okay, so I will see you tomorrow and we will find out the story of how Eric met Eva Smith.